In this week's video, I want to discuss two things. The first is a simple explanation about how I make these tiny lidded jars. And the second topic I want to discuss is how to price small pots like these, which are still really labour intensive to make. So let's begin with the process behind trimming one of these. I threw all these pieces 2 days prior to this, and I've kept them wrapped up in plastic ever since to make sure they remain at the perfect leather hard condition. And catching pots like this at the right moment is crucial, as they're all relatively small parts and would dry out very quickly if unchecked. When I threw these pots, I made sure the opening at the top was the same for each. This way I can throw lids that are all identical too, which just makes the throwing process a bit easier, as I'm not having to throw different sized lids for each pot. Yet I've thrown each lid to be slightly larger than it need be. They're quite thick and they're wider and taller than necessary, which means each can be trimmed in its own way in order to fit the pot beneath it. Lastly, the size of the lid is larger simply to make the process of throwing them easier, as if I used the absolute perfect amount of clay for each, I'd end up throwing these very tiny, fiddly lids, which I'd never be able to remove from the wheel easily, unless I was making them on bats or throwing off the hump. But the way I see it, I'd rather throw them quickly and roughly, and then fix them at the trimming stage, which is the process that's about to happen. But first, tools. Obviously, for these smaller jars, I need to use trimming tools which are smaller too. And of course the very tiniest of my maker's marks, which I carved from a block of porcelain and were reduction fired to 1290 degrees Celsius, so they shrank even more. Now, the two components of these jars at this point don't necessarily fit perfectly. I intentionally throw the protruding portion of the lid to be a bit wider than I need. This way I can always trim them back to fit perfectly, whereas if I was to try and throw them to fit exactly right at the start and they didn't quite fit as they were too small, it's much harder to add material to leather hard clay than it is to remove it. So by giving myself an extra millimetre or two, it just gives me a slight safety net, and it means that I know with all certainty that all my lids will fit. With that being said, before I begin this trimming process, I try to make sure that both the lid and jar are the exact same level of dryness, as if one component is considerably drier than the other, this means it's further along the process of turning bone dry, and proportionally may have shrunk more than the other piece, which means, whilst you might be able to get them to fit, as they dry out further after being trimmed, they may suddenly begin to not fit. The lid could rattle in situ, or the lid could suddenly become stuck on the pot as the rim of the jar has shrunk around it. So before I begin trimming both parts to fit, I make sure that the two components are more or less the same condition. With the lid securely fastened in place on the wheel, I trim the side of the vertical protruding flange until the jar slots really perfectly over it. And once that measurement has been set, I can go about cleaning up the rest of the lid, such as removing some of the excess clay from inside and just generally straightening up the walls and removing the worst of the marks left by the trimming tools. As I trim, I continually test to see if the jar fits, and as I know the lid isn't going to be this wide, I quickly remove this edge, as this part can be trickier to turn away once the lid's on top of the pot. The lid isn't finished, but in order to trim the top of it, I first have to make some progress with the body of the jar. It's slipped, tap-centered, and rubbed back and forth in situ to create friction in order to help stick it down. The last part of this process is just to seal the base. You can quite clearly see that this piece is relatively wonky, but I should be able to fix much of that throughout this trimming process. At the same time, as long as the pot has been finished to a relatively high degree, I don't mind if there's a subtle irregularity to them like this, because as soon as the wheel stops, your eye ceases to notice the undulating section. To fix the rim, I trim away the highest point that's spinning around, as otherwise the lid might lean to one side when it's placed on top. But I do need to be careful not to remove too much from this part of the pot, as it has to be strong enough to support the weight of the lid and my fingers pressing down on it. This means I tend not to finish the topmost portion of the pot until after the lid has been trimmed. This way there's enough supportive material left in the top to withstand the process of the lid being refined. The lid is then picked up and put down in place until it spins around evenly and so that it's level. With my fingers pushing down firmly on top, I can trim away excess from the side and generally just refine the lid to a place where it feels correct, proportionally, and not so overpowering. This even includes removing clay from the top, which, as the lid fits so well into the jar beneath it, is relatively straightforward, as in a way, the body of the jar is acting like a chuck for the lid. In the past, I think I've been guilty of leaving my lids a bit thick, so lately I've made an effort to make them thinner and work more harmoniously with the body underneath. The lids of these jars don't just have flat tops, instead I trim a very slight hollow into them. This way an area is created into which the glaze can pool. And before taking this off and finishing the jar, I just burnish the top, which leaves a lovely smooth surface as opposed to one that can be slightly gritty. With the lid now more or less finished, I can refine that top portion of the jar. I do this by thinning the walls out and further defining the shape. I check to see if the lid fits one last time before removing the vessel from the wheel, which I do by sliding a sharp metal knife underneath it. The final step is of course the base, and this time I can use the lid, like a chuck, to turn the body of the jar. Each component helps the trimming process of the other. Once tap centered, the lid is secured in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, and then I can finish trimming the underside of the pot, which sometimes begins with just tapering in this lower half just a touch more. I think for smaller pots like this, which can be so tricky to turn, it helps to have some very sharp turning tools. As with these, you don't have to push very hard for them to remove clay, whereas with blunter, stainless steel blades, you sometimes need to push with them really firmly before they start removing any clay in a meaningful way, which means you're more likely to push the pot off-center or deform the already rather thin walls. But with a sharp tool that's just less likely to happen. Although using sharp tools like this is another challenge in itself, as it's so easy to overdo it. So for some details I do end up switching back to the cheaper tools, as there's just less of a chance they'll catch or really gouge into the clay and pull the entire piece off center. Lastly, I burnish over the trimmed areas on the base, as this portion will remain bare clay once fired, which typically means I spend a bit more time and attention finishing it, as it won't be hidden by glaze like the rest of the pot is. If you look closely on this portion of the lid, you can see where the rim of the jar rubbed against the corner of the lid, marking it and creating a slightly scruffy surface. So to fix that, I upturn the lid one last time, tap center it, and then just very lightly glide my turning tool back over these areas, redefining those planes. I hope from watching this process you can see just how finicky and tricky this is when working on such a small scale. In some ways I find making pots like this, at this scale, far more difficult than those maybe 2, 3 times the size and even larger, as there being more material in the pot means there's more weight to both components and they sort of hold themselves down on the wheel as they're trimmed. Whereas with these smaller jars, as they're so light, all it takes is one wrong move to pull the piece off center, or for it to fly off to one side, or for, well, a whole number of other things to happen which are just much more likely to occur on a smaller scale. The making of small stuff is tricky, but at least the glazing and firing is easy. At the same time, finishing one of these pots arguably takes just as much time as a slightly larger piece, and since we're working with clay where the actual raw material cost is so little, how on earth do you go about pricing pieces like this fairly? They do of course take up less space in the kiln, and it takes far less glaze to coat one of these as compared to a much larger example, but it still took me the same amount of time to throw them, trim them, glaze them and fire them. So how do you price them without losing out too much? Now, perhaps annoyingly, I don't have a solid answer, as I don't think there really is one answer that fits all. There are so many factors in play here, such as the type of object you're making. For instance, I think it would be more difficult to charge more for an espresso cup as compared to a small keep-safe jar like this, even though the creation of an espresso cup probably takes the same amount of time to make as a mug. So we're running into another similar problem. Another factor that of course helps is how well known you are and for how much you can sell your pots, typically, and this whole conundrum becomes less of a problem the more expensive your work is. Whereas if you're only just beginning and your work is still relatively cheap, pots like espresso cups, tiny jars like this, or very small bowls are actually really difficult to make any profit on, as there's simply no way you can recoup the time spent making them with enough money. I think this is why perhaps in the past I avoided making things like espresso cups, but obviously as you get faster and better and more accurate as a maker, you can throw smaller pots at much greater speed, but processes like this where they're refined can take just as long and can end up being really tricky, fiddly and often frustrating work. Anyway, the point of bringing this up isn't because I think I have a solution, there isn't one, but I really would love to hear what you think, and if you happen to be a potter, how you've dealt with work like this, on this scale. As for these really tiny jars, I'm making them to display along larger versions in order to create more interesting arrangements of pots for my exhibition at Yorkshire Sculpture Park, which begins in November. This is the first time I've made smaller pieces like this with more distinct angular bodies, and I absolutely adore them at this scale. I just hope the glazing works and that they fire nicely. The first batch of these will be reduction fired sometime next week, so if you would like a sneak preview of how these look, make sure you check out my Instagram, as over there I post more standalone pictures of my work, and it tends to follow a more realistic and chronological path as compared to my channel here, where videos are released more seldomly. Lastly, just a huge thank you to everyone who came to one of my events last week, which marked the publication of By My Hands, A Potter's Apprenticeship. This is my first book, and it's now out in the UK, and it can be found in most bookshops, a prospect I still find totally surreal. If you are reading it, or have somehow read it already, please do let me know what you think. I'd love to hear from you. Anyway, that's all for this week's short video. Thanks, as always, for taking your time to watch, and I'll see you next week.